Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. Today I will be coloring the images in the Altenew Blooms of Friendship stamp set, and I will be using the coordinating dies. The packaging from Altenew is fabulous. All of the stamp sets that I'm aware of come with this fold out. There are panels that you can cut apart and use as card fronts. There is an inside portion where it tells you, it shows you how you could assemble these die or these stamps together, the color combinations used in these examples. There are other products you could pair with this particular stamp set. I mean, just really top-notch packaging. I'm also using a different cardstock today. This is Hammermill 110 pound. It is a little less thick or less sturdy than I thought it would be compared to my Nina, but I've heard it does well with Copic markers, and that's what we're coloring with today. I did choose Copic markers that were the same kinds of colors that were used in the Altenew images, although they were used, the images in the stamped packaging, they used the Altenew markers, but I tried to mimic that. I am stamping all of the images, well, words are hard, in Simon Says stamp, intense black ink. I'm going to stamp everything twice because my ink pad is dry and I need to get a re-inker. I planned to do 2 cards. I ended up with 3, and I used some Altenew enamel dots in the Sugar Plum, Forest Trail, and Golden Sunset packages at the end of to finish off the cards. I think that's all about the coloring. So let's go ahead and jump into the crime. Today, our alphabetical journey takes us to Rhode Island. Now, I think I've caught up with where I started, giving you background on the states and their history, so we're going to kind of skip that. We're just going to talk about the fact that Rhode Island ratified the Constitution on May 29th of 1790 and became the 13th of the original 13 colonies to join the Union. Rhode Island is the smallest in area, the 8th in population, but the 2nd in population density, which is interesting. It is best known for the seaside colonial towns, sailing and fishing, and vacationers. And Rhode Island their infrastructure is like vacationing, manufacturing, and they're known for giant trees. Rhode Island was also the location of a family rift gone very, very wrong. Now, Benjamin J. Burton was one of Newport, Rhode Island's most liked citizens. Benjamin was born in 1826 in Connecticut. He was likely the son of former slaves or freed African Americans, and his parents aren't even listed on the records I could find for him, which is interesting given his prominence. There's not a lot written about his life prior to his wedding to Rosanna Babcock. Rosanna was born in 1830 in Maryland, and it lists her father as Caesar Babcock. It does not list her mother and things I could find. And together, Benjamin and Rosanna had 9 children, 7 boys and 2 girls. And they settled in Newport after their wedding, and all of their children were born in Newport, Rhode Island. At the time that Benjamin and Rosanna moved to Newport, Benjamin was working as a teamster hauling coal and goods from the docks up to the business owners in town. And in the middle of the 19th century, Newport became the newest summer vacationing spot for the country's most wealthy, the most elite. It was called the Gilded Age of American history. Benjamin was an industrious man, and he actually became Rhode Island's first black business owner. He eventually saved enough money working for the Teamsters to trade in that grind, working for other people, and created a hauling company. Now, at first, he worked through the summer vacation weeks, hauling vacationers and their trunks and suitcases from the docks up to the vastly expanding area of summer vacation homes. Benjamin was strong, he was personable, and he quickly became a favorite of the citizens both in the town and the visiting vacationers. And this business allowed him to make enough money to turn that summer job into a transportation empire. Now, originally, the Burtons purchased a home in a part of Newport that was considered undesirable to most other people. It was farther away from work and shopping and worshiping areas than most people wanted to live. This is, the mid-1800s. We're talking foot transportation. Okay. Benjamin actually solved that problem by creating public transportation. For 10 cents, a person could ride on one of his wagons from this new up-and-coming neighborhood outside of the city center into the parts of Newport where the shopping and the churches and the schools and businesses were. And people of all economic classes used Benjamin's transportation. It was not just the poorer people who lived out of town. It was everybody, even the more elite people in town, used Benjamin's mass transit. Now, Benjamin became one of Newport's most loved and well-respected citizens. He had business partners who thought he was above board. His neighbors, the people he transported goods for, he just was well-liked. His children grew up in a type of luxury, and not real luxury, like working class luxury, but his children did not have to go to work in a factory. They did not have to join a Teamsters union, and his daughters did not have to take in laundry or mending clothes to support their own families. The family had a stellar reputation, and Benjamin was known about town as being jovial. He was a good-natured man. He had a quick wit and a rather kind disposition. Rosanna and Benjamin lived in Newport with their children their whole married life. Rosanna actually passed away January 18th, 1881, and their youngest daughter, Emmy, was about 14 when Rosanna passed away. Now, with Rosanna's death, that left Benjamin to finish raising his children and make sure, his 7 girls, all had good marriages, because it's the 1800s, and that was what was needed to support them, right? So we're going to fast forward 4 years after Rosanna's death. It's October 6th, 1885, and it was a regular kind of day in Newport. People got up, they went to work, they dressed their children, they, took them to school, they took care of the daily shopping, their other chores. It was rainy, and people weren't really used to minding other people's business, especially on a cool fall rainy day, right? Then there was a muffled sound, what was later determined to be a gunshot. And it was so muffled by the sound of the rain and the sound of people moving around them that nobody really paid attention to it until the second gunshot and the screaming began. The screams came from the Burton house, and a young woman was heard and seen screaming, quote, "Help, my father has shot himself," end quote. The neighbors came rushing to the house, and they were met by one of Benjamin's daughters who said, quote, "Father has killed himself. Go and get somebody," end quote. And she pointed anybody who wanted to come and see and directed them into the kitchen. She pointed to the back of the house and sent them into the kitchen. Now, the scene in the kitchen was one of nightmares. Okay, sprawled on the floor near the table was 59-year-old Benjamin, a pistol by his side. A delivery driver who came into the house after the screaming gently picked up Benjamin's wrist to check for a pulse, lowered it back to the ground, shaking his head, indicating that he could not find one. In his opinion, Benjamin was gone. A policeman who was on his rounds in the neighborhood was summoned into the kitchen. He confirmed the lack of pulse and then called for the medical examiner to handle a declaration of death. The medical examiner came and quickly took control of the situation. He looked over the kitchen and noted, wrote down that there were 2 bullet wounds, one to the back side of his head behind the ear and one to the left side of his chest. It was also noted that Benjamin had unchewed bread in his mouth. With very little pomp or circumstances, Benjamin was declared dead. The coroner was called, and it was his job then to conduct the investigation. The coroner, whose name I did not find in the source that I have linked below, began an investigation first by asking to speak to the family members who were in the home. He found said family members all huddled together in an upstairs bedroom. Included in this group was 24-year-old daughter Maria and her new husband Alan. The youngest daughter Emmy was also there. Now, when asked, Emmy said that she didn't hear the gunshots or recognize a sound that she thought was gunshots because she was in the third floor of the house at the time. She said that she didn't really even know who had been screaming, but assumed that it was Maria. And Maria told the coroner that she had actually been in a neighbor's home at the time of the shooting, and when she came back, she found her father. Maria's husband, Alan, told the coroner that he was upstairs in an upstairs bedroom because he was sick, and he thought that the gunshots were just somebody slamming doors. Now, admittedly, I haven't heard a gunshot from the mid-1800s, 1885, but that's a rough sell. If you're in the home where the gunshots occurred, that's a rough sell. Anyway, upon questioning, each family member told the coroner that Benjamin had been quite despondent in recent days. The daughters both claimed that their father had told them he didn't expect to live much longer. But those statements, they came as a surprise to people in the community who knew Benjamin and knew the family. That just was so outside his character that it was a surprise. Even though the community's description of Benjamin was vastly different from the picture painted by the family, the coroner decided that there was enough evidence to support the claim of a suicide and snapped shut his notebook, called the case closed, and not in need of further investigation. Red flags. I'm throwing them. There's red flags flying everywhere. This is my brain, not everybody's brain, but my mind is going, really? 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 Okay. So Benjamin's funeral was held just 2 days after his death. And even though they were reeling, the community members gathered for his service, and there was not just people from every possible economic class and every race that existed in Newport at the time descended upon the Union Congregational Church where the service was held. The church was standing room only, and mourners even spilled out into the walkway and onto the street. This is how, the shock, but also this just shows, Benjamin really was a well-liked man. He just was liked. So among the most prominent mourners at Benjamin's funeral was his sister-in-law, Emily Burton. She was the wife of his brother, and she was known to be a force in social circles. She was described as having, quote, a great willpower and magnetism, someone who could set a whole congregation shouting during a meeting, end quote. And when Emily saw her brother at the viewing prior to the funeral, she reportedly asked a policeman if Benjamin had been murdered. Also prominent citizen in attendance was George Downing. Now, George was one of the most influential civil rights leaders in that part of the country, or maybe even in the country. He was a friend of Benjamin's, but he was also a friend of Frederick Douglass. So he worked hand in hand with Frederick Douglass, and they worked together to form the country's first black labor union in New York City. So, again, Benjamin just was liked. He was a good guy, apparently. Now, Emily, the sister-in-law, she was not the only one sure that Benjamin's suicide was not a suicide. Okay? Other people in the community were curious, especially when it became known that the investigation was, lacking. Let's just call it lacking. In fact, by the time that Benjamin's death notice had been published in the evening paper, before the funeral even, questions were already being openly asked. And the gossip did what gossip does, and rumors did what rumors does. And the two people at the center of the rumor and at the center of the gossip were Maria and her new husband, Alan. So Maria was 24-year-old. So she was the third from the youngest, I believe, or fourth from the youngest child of Rosanna and Benjamin. And she got married to a man named Alan Waldorf Dorsey on the 17th of June, 1885. So just a few months before her father's death. Like 3 months. June, July, August. Yeah, 3 months. Now, Alan was the son of a barber, and he was on track to be the first black surgeon in the state of Rhode Island. He was a student. He actually had graduated from Lincoln University in Pennsylvania and was headed to medical school. Okay. During his undergrad, he worked all through school as a waiter at Newport's resort hotels through the summer times. So during the summer, he would come to Newport, Rhode Island. He worked in all the hotels where the fancy rich people were. He saved up his money and he paid for his undergrad. In 1877, Dorsey was introduced, so Alan was introduced to Maria, and they began a courtship that did ultimately end up with their marriage. So they were married when Alan had only 1 year of medical school left. Okay, he was almost done. But as the son of a barber, he was nearly destitute. He was not sure where the money for that last year of school was going to come from. And his luck changed when he met and then married Maria. And because Maria had been promised a sizable dowry. We're not going to talk about what we think about dowries. I kind of like the idea that somebody's paying for the privilege of marrying my daughters, but also there's that whole I'm paying you to marry my daughter thing. We're not going to talk about dowries, though. To Benjamin's chagrin, Alan, who had previously been noted as a hard worker and as hard, he studied hard, a student that studied hard, he spent all summer not working. Instead, he lazed around the Burton family home, and he walked around town like he was a man of means and had no reason to work. Benjamin and Rosanna had raised their children to work hard. Quite the opposite of what Benjamin now observed in Alan. And Benjamin's observation of Alan and his behavior reportedly led him to threaten to withhold Maria's dowry. Now, Alan's lazy summer was not the only reason that Benjamin was becoming worried about the two. Benjamin had received an anonymous letter that stated Maria had been involved in a financial scandal. Benjamin then paid a trip, this is before his death, paid a trip to his sister-in-law, Emily, because Emily knew all the things. Emily just knew all the things, right? Emily knew firsthand about this scandal involving Marie and Alan. And it could be that the letter Benjamin got told him that Emily would know about it. I don't know. I don't have a copy or didn't see a transcript of the letter. But anyway, Emily told Benjamin that Alan had written her the previous spring, so the spring before his wedding even, and asked to borrow $125. $125 in 1885 was a substantial amount of money. Emily refused to lend him money and refused to give him money. Emily then learned that Maria had actually borrowed that same amount of money from a cousin in New York, promising to repay the debt once her father paid the dowry. And this cousin had reportedly secured a promissory note from Maria for the loan. But this note mysteriously disappeared from her locked trunk when she was visiting the Burton home. More recently, though, Emily had heard that Maria had concocted a story about a relative who committed a murder and desperately needed money to flee the country. To Maria, this story seemed like the plot of a novel, right? But apparently, Maria was moderately successful in using that story, and she collected a little bit of money. It was less than Alan needed to finish medical school, though. Now, dumbfounded by all he had learned, Benjamin thanked his sister-in-law and returned home to confront his daughter. When he got home, Benjamin asked his daughter about borrowing the money, and Marie denied that she had borrowed any money, and that the story about a family needing to flee the country, that was news to her. She had no idea where. I just don't even know, Dad. I've never heard that before in my life, kind of thing, right? Benjamin didn't believe her, and he began to question her husband's lack of work. Benjamin told her and her told Marie that her and her, quote, lazy husband needed to get their stuff together and get prepared to move out of the family home. They were no longer welcome. And this argument happened like within days of Benjamin's death. More red flags. If this was a video where you could see me, you'd see all the flags flying. They're just red. They're flying everywhere. Now, Newport may have been home to many prosperous African Americans, but racial tensions in the 1880s were still very much in the daily news. And one thing that wasn't, though, racially motivated in Newport in 1885 was the divide between those who believed Benjamin committed suicide and those who thought it was murder. People from all races and economic statuses chose the side they believed in most. Do you remember George? George, I can't remember his last name now all of a sudden. The one who worked with Frederick Douglass, right? He was one of Allen's biggest supporters. George was of the opinion that Allen was the new poster boy for successful African-American men. Because with a little bit of luck and a lot of hard work, there was nothing they couldn't achieve. And he's not wrong. But he might have picked the wrong horse to bet on. So the debate between murder or not murder eventually found its way to the desk of up-and-coming attorney, a man named Patrick Galvin. And Patrick questioned the likelihood of suicide. Patrick, the son of Irish immigrants, had established a reputation as a patron of lost causes due to his vigorous and often outspoken legal defenses of poor immigrants and other underrepresented residents of Newport. So he was the attorney for the little guy. He was convinced that Benjamin had been murdered, and he believed that there should be a formal inquest into his death. Authorities did not share Patrick's opinion, and they were just ready. They wanted this over with. They wanted it out of the news. They wanted people to stop talking about it. They wanted to stop dealing with it. Try as they might, the authorities could not avoid the accusations of foul play. Like, people were not stopping to talk about it. They just would not stop talking about it. There we go. They wouldn't. Both sides of the argument claimed that they were the one who kind of pushed the Attorney General to intervene. But eventually, 10 days after his death, the Attorney General did intervene, and Benjamin's body was exhumed, so a real investigation could be conducted. In addition, the Attorney General actually appointed Patrick Galvin to represent the state in the inquest. And that kind of proved to be a smart plan for the Attorney General. Now, I didn't write down his name either. So, the exhumation took place at 1 a.m., middle of the night, dark 30 hours, right? In life, Benjamin was a large man, weighing in at about 250 pounds. So it took several men to pull the coffin from the grave. The medical examiner actually used the coffin as an exam table with lanterns providing the light. So they did this autopsy in the dead of night. And I think that was a cultural thing. People did not like the idea of disturbing a cemetery or a grave. And also people didn't want to watch it or have it be seen. So I think that was kind of a cultural norm. If this had to happen, it was going to be when nobody was out walking through the park, right? So an autopsy was conducted, and a couple of things that showed up in this autopsy was that there was no gunpowder residue on Benjamin's hands or on his body, like his head or his chest. And based on the lack of gunshot residue and the fact there was unchewed bread in his mouth when he died, the conclusion was that there wasn't a gun in Benjamin's hand that morning, but probably a breakfast roll. And breakfast rolls don't shoot people, so, you know. The inquest lasted 4 days. There were 62 witnesses testifying. Conflicting accounts were given concerning Benjamin's state of mind and his financial situation at the time of his death. Friends and neighbors testified. Some friends and neighbors had heard Benjamin they testified that they'd heard Benjamin making statements about self-harm, saying things like he wished he could float away in the waves, crawl into a hole and die, or blow his brains out with a pistol. But one opinion that was shared by all the physicians who testified was that the shot to Benjamin's heart would have been instantly fatal. So, if these shots were self-inflicted, he would have had to shoot himself in the head first, not died, and then shot himself in the chest. It couldn't have happened in the other order. The physicians who asserted murder as the cause of death testified that the shot to the head would have, at a minimum, caused loss of consciousness, rendering anyone incapable of inflicting a second gunshot wound to themselves. There was no way like Patrick argued, there was no way that Benjamin could have inflicted both wounds on himself. Having made his case that Benjamin was murdered, Patrick then turned his attention to identifying the person or people most likely responsible. So he called his star witness, Emily Burton, the sister-in-law, who eagerly testified about her conversation with Benjamin concerning Maria and Alan Dorsey, Benjamin's daughter. A neighbor that lived in the home where Maria, near where Maria lived with her father, she testified that she overheard the argument between Maria and Benjamin the week before his death, the one where he told her she had to leave. When it was Marie and Alan's turn to take the stand, they each, cool as a cucumber, they repeated the events on the morning of Benjamin's death about Alan being sick in bed and Marie being next door and coming home and finding her father dead on the floor. When questioned about their involvement, their pleas of innocence seemed so sincere that even some of their more harshest critics started to think that maybe they were wrong. Maybe Benjamin had inflicted these wounds on himself. And was Patrick really being a prosecutor, or was he just persecuting this family? Now, George Downing, the civil rights leader, the one who really thought Alan was like the next big thing, right? He testified that he observed Benjamin to be, quote, in a despondent state, end quote, which he attributed to financial embarrassment over gambling losses. George even used a pseudonym, like a fake name, to write a letter to the editor of the Newport Daily News criticizing Patrick's investigation. He alleged that Patrick was not pursuing critical evidence concerning the supposed gambling habits. Contrary to George's assertion, Patrick had already chased that horse. He had already followed up on that lead, and none of the saloon owners or the residents in town were either able or ready to testify about illegal gambling, and none of them even could put Benjamin in that lifestyle. Ultimately, the coroner did rule that Benjamin died of 2 shots fired by persons unknown. So that removes the idea of suicide. This finding ruled out suicide, but the coroner did refuse to identify the Dorseys, Marie and Alan, as the probable killers, which was a disappointment to Patrick. And the Dorsey supporters claimed the ruling was a vindication for them, but it really left a cloud of suspicion over this innocent man. So Patrick was undeterred. He pored over the inquest testimony. He did start focusing his attention on the youngest daughter, Emmy, and the neighbor who had confirmed Maria's timeline, where, she had been next door during the time of the murder. Faced with a threat of perjury, Emmy changed her story. She admitted that only 5 minutes, not 20 minutes as she had originally said, Only 5 minutes had elapsed between the sound of gunshots and Maria's scream, which alerted the entire neighborhood that her father had shot himself. So this revised statement called into question Maria's entire timeline. And that was enough to convince authorities to arrest Alan and Maria. Stunned by the arrest, the couple prepared to fight for their lives. They retained an attorney named Colonel William Payne Sheffield Jr. Now, William was another up-and-coming star in the legal community, and he came from a family of attorneys that represented normally wealthy white individuals in just, the uppers, right? William had resources and connections at his disposal that Patrick probably didn't have. However, Patrick was a formidable opponent. The Dorseys' arrest, they were arrested on November 19th, so about a month after Benjamin's death. And Maria's younger sister, Emmy, was sent to stay with Emily. And Emily made no effort to hide her belief that Alan and Maria were responsible for Benjamin's death. By Sunday night after their arrest, Emmy suffered a severe lung hemorrhage. It was suggested that the rapid deterioration in the girl's health was a direct result of her aunts badgering her about Maria and Alan. Fearing she was dying, Emmy begged her aunt to get Patrick and the coroner to her sickbed. So, using all of the strength she could muster, Emmy revealed a truth about her father's death. Alan had shot Benjamin while he sat at the kitchen table eating his breakfast. Maria had known her husband was going to kill her father. Hello? Her revelation that the Dorseys were responsible for Benjamin's murder was not, news to Patrick. But Emmy's confession that she acted as the lookout took everybody by surprise. What? Everybody by surprise. She's like 18 years old at this point. At the first light of the following day, newspapers, the newspaper boys, the newsies, they were shouting the headline, and the headline was, quote, "Read all about it. Burton's daughter confesses. Daughter says Dorseys pulled the trigger." Okay. People were in a frenzy. They were taking the papers. They were ripping them out of the hands people were in a frenzy. Okay. They were in a frenzy. A few days later, Emmy was accompanied by a doctor and her aunt to the courthouse to put her confession on record. In her weakened condition, Emily was very unsteady. Maria was shocked by her sister's physical appearance, and instead of taking a seat in the gallery with the other spectators, Aunt Emily sat right next to Emmy and held on to her tightly, held her hand while she was testifying. I don't know if that was physical strength, emotional strength, or coercion. I don't know. But Emmy told her confession, and it was voluntary, and she stated that she couldn't hold back anymore because the guilt was killing her, quote, inch by inch. Alan was meticulous, and he was taking notes, and he was, people made comments that he was taking notes like he was going to be the questioning authority here, right? After these proceedings, both Alan and Marie were held without bail, and they were held for trial. Now, despite Emmy's detailed but heart-wrenching confession about Alan and Maria's roles in Benjamin's death, the community still was divided and bitterly divided over whether or not Marie and Alan were guilty. George and other civil rights leaders stood behind Alan. They insisted he had no motive to kill Benjamin. He had managed to put himself through college and 2 years of medical school without Benjamin's money. They pointed to numerous letters, character references on Alan's behalf about his exemplary character. They just were convinced that he was innocent. He didn't do it. He was the bomb.com, right? Patrick's strategy of separating Emmy from Marie and Alan was successful. And now his plan was to separate Marie and Alan to see if he could repeat that success. And his coup de grace, I guess, or his winning numbers came when Patrick found out Marie was pregnant. He actually petitioned the court to transfer her from the Newport County Jail to a more local jail, or to a larger jail, because his argument was that the local small jail could not provide the level of medical care needed for her in her, quote, delicate condition. So the court was persuaded that Maria could be better cared for in the state prison with its round-the-clock matrons and on-staff physicians. So her transfer was immediately ordered. The prison personnel assigned to care for Marie during her pregnancy felt that it was unlikely she would actually live long enough to give birth. She had come down with consumption, aka tuberculosis, and it had taken over her whole body. But to their astonishment, on April 2nd, 1886, Marie gave birth to a small but healthy baby boy. The trial against the Dorseys began at the end of June, so about a year after they got married, sometime after Benjamin's death. Patrick planned to use medical evidence he gathered from Civil War doctors to prove that the lack of gunpowder on Benjamin's hands ruled out suicide. William planned to use the testimony of David Hayes Agnew. And this was a doctor who had actually served as President James Garfield's primary surgeon after his assassination attempt. And this doctor was going to testify that Benjamin had actually committed suicide. Okay. William planned to provide evidence that Benjamin was a gambler and that he was deep in depression, and he was certain he was going to win. William was certain that Alan and Marie were going to be not convicted. So the day before the trial began, Alan actually gave an interview to a newspaper reporter from his jail cell. And at first, he just patted himself on the back, saying his own praises, just a poor barber's son. I worked my way through college, blah, 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 blah. When the reporter asked about Emmy's confession, Alan dismissed it by stating that she was, quote, a hysterical, underdeveloped girl under the control of her aunt, end quote. He told the reporter that the more intelligent portion of the community would have to believe him. It basically would be stupid to believe Emmy. So the Dorseys entered the courtroom, and Marie's carrying their new baby, and she's cooing at it, and he's playing peekaboo, and they're just the picture of perfection, right? Patrick began by reciting everything he knew about Benjamin's standing in the community. He called business partners who spoke of a successful business that, while it did sometimes carry debt, that was not abnormal, and that his business was successful enough that Benjamin could retire and live off the profits easily. They rebutted gambling rumors, and I think that, if he had a gambling problem, he'd be stealing money from his business. So I guess Patrick assumed or, decided they would know. And they said no, there was no gambling that we ever saw any evidence of. And this was and then Patrick presented his evidence against suicide, the medical evidence from the Civil War doctor. And the jury, the evidence was gruesome. And the jury, they listened. It could not have been easy, and it was reported that they listened and they took it all in and they were thoughtful about it. After the long day of testimony, Maria summoned her pastor. Okay, so the pastor was awakened by a pounding on his door, and it was a jailer from the state prison who had been sent to get him on Maria's behalf. When the pastor got to the jail, he was met there by Patrick as well, and they were escorted into a room where Maria was waiting for them. The pastor prayed with her, and when he was done praying, he sat and waited for Maria to speak. And apparently it was a little while, and she told him that she could not bear to sit in the courtroom another day. She begged to be returned to the women's prison, and the pastor was speechless. He told her the trial was far from over and the defense had just begun to present its case, and he reminded her that she could still be acquitted of all of the charges. Maria shook her head. She said she would never be able to atone for her role in the death of her father. She wept, reportedly, she wept as she described her father's kindness to her and her shame at being involved in his death. She claimed she needed to confess and go back to prison to stay for the rest of her life. So Patrick was called into the room, and he spent the next 2 hours recording Marie's confession. Marie described Alan's descent into madness after he learned that her father would not pay the dowry. He had become convinced that Benjamin was preventing him from achieving his dream of becoming a surgeon. And she realized he had only married her because of her father's money. When Benjamin wouldn't pay the dowry, by the time Alan expected to receive it, he had actually become abusive toward her. Marie told Patrick about how Alan had hissed that he'd been duped into marrying her and was ruined as a result. And he even threatened to divorce her. And she was mortified at the thought of being divorced and was desperate to please her husband. She begged her father to pay the dowry, but he ignored her pleas. He was not going to give Alan any money. As the start of the school semester approached, Alan was more and more frantic, and he was pressuring Marie to find the money, to get the money. So that's where we hear about this financial scandal that she was involved in. She had already begged and borrowed and even stolen from people, from friends, from family, and she was at a loss. And teetering on the brink of madness, she blurted out that she'd once overheard her father discussing a substantial life insurance policy with her mother. And she told her husband that she thought the policy could be found in her father's safe. So she told Patrick that she only mentioned the existence of the life insurance policy as a mean of appeasing Alan. Look, eventually we'll get the money kind of thing, right? Just be patient. Let me convince him to pay the dowry. She was certain that she could get her father to change his mind and to pay the dowry in time for him to go back to medical school. And when it became clear to her in the argument that she had with her father the week before his death that it was not going to happen, she could no longer keep her husband under control. He began to plot the death of her father. Marie pleaded with him not to do it, and Alan called her, quote, chicken-hearted. Dude, he's evil. Anyway, she continued with her confession by stating that on October 6th, Alan announced to Marie and Emmy that he had waited long enough. He went into into his room, took his own gun, sent Maria to the neighbors, and told Emmy to go act as the lookout. And as Benjamin was eating his breakfast sweet roll, Alan tiptoed down the stairs, entered the kitchen, shot him from behind. And the impact of the bullet caused Benjamin to fall to the floor. Alan was terrified, horrified. He was still alive, so he had to shoot him again. This is all in Marie's confession. She concluded her confession by stating that she never believed her husband would kill her father. And when Patrick stopped writing, he put his pen in Marie's hand, and she signed it. And then he signed it as a witness. So the trial resumed. William now only has one client, and he tried with all of his legal might to defend him. His first attempt was to have Marie's confession thrown out because she cannot testify against her husband. And the judge said that was true, but there was nothing preventing the priest from testifying as to what he heard Marie say because there was a third person in the room, Patrick, right? So that caused William to attempt to separate Alan and Marie's cases. And that was unsuccessful. The judge said, nope, not having that. William sat down as the trial was sent to the jury. While William's doing his thing, Alan is sitting at the table. He's cleaning his his fingernails with a penknife. He's flipping through newspapers. He's reading articles about the trial. He is looking like he is got no problems. The jury returned a verdict of guilty, and life sentences were handed down for Alan and Marie. The next morning, Alan confessed to his jailer that he did, in fact, kill Benjamin, saying, quote, "What my controlling motive was, no living person knows and never will," end quote. And he said it wasn't for the money, but nobody's going to know why I did this. So Emmy also received a life sentence, but she died 6 months later from tuberculosis. Her body wasn't claimed, and so Patrick offered to take her and have her buried next to her parents, but her body was too badly, like she was so sick that they just buried her in the prison graveyard. Alan and Marie's baby boy was removed from their care and adopted out. His name was changed, and his family moved out of state after his adoption, probably for his protection. My goodness. Marie was reportedly despondent after her baby was taken, and she claimed she just wanted to die. And 2 years into her sentence, she also died from tuberculosis. On her deathbed, as she was dying, Alan was permitted to come see Marie. And in this sweet final moment, he asked her to sign a paper taking full responsibility for her father's death and to forgive him. She refused. She was like, yep, no. When that plan failed, he contacted this journalist again and claimed that he had killed Benjamin because he had, quote, had been criminally intimate with Marie. The claim of incest was not well received by the community, and when Marie heard about it from her sickbed, she sent a letter to the newspaper fiercely rebuting it. She sent other papers and letters from Alan that disputed his claim and supported the motive of money. So Alan's a big old sicko. Alan stayed in prison for 25 years, and by all accounts, he was a model prisoner throughout the term of his incarceration. He attempted several times and was unsuccessful, but he eventually did receive a pardon in 1912. In 1912, he moved to New York City, and he worked as a waiter until he passed away in 1918 at the age of 60 and was buried in Potter's Field. Alan and Maria's son was named Ernest Young, and after the death of his adoptive parents, he moved to Virginia, and where he lived until he was 83. He never married. He had no children. He was the last known direct descendant of Benjamin Burton, the trailblazing entrepreneur once thought to be the wealthiest black man in Rhode Island. So, y'all, families, be careful who you marry. Just be careful who you marry. I was like, when I first saw this story, I was intrigued, and then I was just like blown away. Like, be careful who you marry. Who you choose is important. Sad note, I couldn't find any pictures, even drawings, except for this picture of their home. I thought that was interesting. So, thanks for hanging out with me today. I know it's been a while. I'm glad you're back. I have a couple other videos here I think you will like. I've also added that subscribe button. If you're new to my channel and haven't subscribed, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment down below. Tell me what you think about this, and have a really fabulous day.